the assignment for this week, because I feel like that'll actually sort of, I guess, help you guys get an idea of like, think about like as we're doing stuff, pick apart things that like might actually be helpful for your assignment. So your assignment this week, I'll be a little bit flexible on the materials, or like the objects that you choose to do, because it's kind of like a random assignment. But so the default thing is like pick an object that's soft and squishy, something like a cushion or like a pet bed or a pillow. The idea was like pick something where you can sculpt in like cloth detail. But again, if there's something that you prefer to do instead, I know in the past the assignment was like model a piece of fruit. So if you'd prefer to do something like that, you're welcome to. But pick something soft and squishy, create a base mesh in Maya, and then you're going to sculpt detail into the piece. And you're going to use either Mudbox or ZBrush to do that. If you are familiar with like another program you prefer to use, run it by me, but like probably fine. And then export a displacement, normal bump maps, and render your object in Maya. So yeah. So basically just like pick object, export displacement map. I mostly just want to get you guys used to working with ZBrush, Mudbox, sculpting things, and making displacement maps, because they are really helpful, especially for anim kids. When you get into organic modeling, you're going to have to do like a whole sculpting thing, and it takes like 40 minutes to export your displacement maps, and I'm like, if you can do it now and experiment and like learn on like 2-minute exports, that's way better than having to export a 40-minute thing 7 times because it's broken. Because that was a fun time. But yeah, and then you're just, again, render your object. So you should do 3 renders of your object from different whatever angles you prefer. Again, I would like at least one of the entire object, just so I can, see the overall aesthetic of the thing. And then if there's like areas that you feel really strongly about, you're welcome to highlight them. You're also welcome to do more renders should you choose. I'll never object to that, unless you send me like 700 renders. And then just zip everything together in your project folder. I would like all the textures you used and the Maya files. And if you happen to have like a ZBrush project or document, you can include that as well. I probably won't actually look at that, but if I need it to troubleshoot anything, like if you're having issues with it, you can include that as well. But yeah. So any questions about the basic requirements of this assignment? All right. And so down here, I attached a few examples of other sort of, I went on Sketchfab and I found some random cushions to help maybe give you guys an idea of what I'm looking for in this assignment specifically. So should you choose to do a cushion, or in this case like a weird looking beanbag chair, plushies would also probably work actually. So in case I haven't gone over the spiel before, I love Sketchfab, it's awesome. I use it, it's just like a way you can upload your models, rotate them around in real time. I use this for my freelance stuff. I'll just like send clients a Sketchfab link and be like, approve model, they can spin it around. It's like really nice. If you go down here, right in the bottom of the screen, you'll see this like little stacked view thing. This is the model inspector, so if you click on that, you can go in, so you can see like the wireframe of the base meshes here. You can basically see it as like just a mesh with a sort of shiny texture on it. Matte cap and surface is a little bit, so that's basic mesh plus any like normal or bump maps that you have on. So you can see if I toggle between, so this is like base mesh, and these are like relatively low poly-ish cushions. They do have like a little bit of baked in detail for the wrinkles on the sides. But if I go into the matte cap and surface, you can see that there's a lot of extra detail that's been added through, in this case, normal maps. You can actually like view their individual channels they've used. Like here's their normal map, roughness maps. They've done a little bit to get that sort of texture in the cloth. But if you look at this, so again, so normal map, they have a little bit of like thread detail in here that you can see. They have these extra cushions here, this seam running along the outside, and you can see that none of that is there in the actual model. So that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for this week, is to basically do something sort of cushiony like this, where you have a relatively simple base mesh, and then through sculpting and texturing, you can achieve a much more refined look. So again, this beanbag chair, like there's no seam in the original base mesh, and then for the sculpt they've added in the seam here, and then a bunch of sort of thick, this looks like corduroy, but they've added like a bunch of thick fabric lines in there. And I set these up a while ago, I don't even remember what cushions I found. But yeah, so, and like here's another example, where, actually, so again, wireframe, you can see that this mesh is like actually really dense. So here's like just the mesh, and then in this case they've used the surface, in this case bump map, so you can see here's their, this is really weird looking. So here's their bump map. You can see they just used that to add a little bit of additional detail into the blanket. So this is probably like a simmed blanket. They probably used like end cloth or something to like actually drape that fabric. And then again, they're just using that bump map to go back in and add like little bits of texture details like right in here, or like just tiny like additional wrinkles. I'm not expecting you guys do like an end cloth simulation or anything with like giant exploded crazy high poly stuff.
Is there any easy way to model this kind of fabric?
Sim it. That's honestly, I would say that's like actually the easiest way, is to just run a simulation. There's also like programs dedicated to just doing cloth sims. Marvelous Designer is like actually really, if you guys are ever like into simulations or cloth sims, just like look into Marvelous Designer. It's pretty interesting. Again, one of the few programs I've paid for. Yeah, if we happen to have time at the end of class today, I could go over like some really basic, just like how to make a tablecloth kind of thing out of end cloth. I was gonna do that, so like week 5 is sort of just like a random floating week. I was actually planning on doing, if anyone had like specific stuff they wanted to go over, or just like if they didn't, just do like random demos of stuff like end cloth. I'll probably send out like a little, what is it? Like a little survey at some point in the next weekish, to see if there's any. Ew. Sorry, just touched something sticky under the desk. That was gross. So I'll see if there's like a survey, if there's anything that you guys would like to go over specifically, or like anything like that, just to try to like, because I want to make this class like things that you guys want to learn. So if there's free time, you know, I'll do that kind of stuff. So if you guys have a preference on like what we go over, please fill out that survey when I email it to you. Anywho. But yeah, so are there any other questions? Dang, they even put in, yo, that's nuts. They actually have, okay, so here's actually an interesting example of, I mean, you can see they've actually modeled in all of the, wow, all right. So they modeled in all of the like pulls in this little headboard thing. In this case, they just used the bump map to go back in and add a sort of generic leather texture to it to give it a little bit more detail. So again, in this case, you probably normal people would just do this with a displacement map and texture all of this in. But I mean, this is definitely one way of doing things. But yeah. So does anybody have questions? And again, I'll go over this a little bit. I'll just make like a sort of on the fly, like weird cushion thing. But does anyone have questions about any of this stuff, like the requirements for the assignment? All right. I think this is the example that I was actually looking for, maybe. This is like one of those fun things where it's like, oh, they added in cushions, or they added in stitches. So you can see again, like base mesh, relatively simple and low poly, and then they've gone through and added in just like little stitches and stuff. I love stitches and things. Just like stitches make everything look really cool if there's supposed to be stitches there. Like if you're ever doing clothing and you just like add in like tiny stitch marks, that kind of stuff goes miles to add like polish and extra detail to your stuff. But yeah, that's my spiel on cushions. So today I'm basically just gonna like show you how to run through ZBrush and export stuff. I also added, in case you guys want to experiment with like other stuff like fine detail, if you guys want to try to like texture a head, give it like weird sci-fi lizard skin or something like that, you're welcome to do that, should you so choose. And I do have that weird self-character, low poly, head only thing in the, if you go to the student resources, broken it. Under sample models, I've added the heads that are already like UV'd, ready to go, should you decide to draw on me and turn me into a weird lizard person. This is acceptable. But yeah, that's pretty much the assignment for this week. So yeah, again, I'm just gonna really quick go through and just show you guys how to make like a crappy little like cushion pillow kind of thing. Alright, so in this case I'm just gonna start with like a random cube, and this is gonna be like a really ugly demo object, just for the record. Actually, no, I'm gonna do a beanbag chair because it's gonna take me way less time to model. Alright, so this is like how to make the world's ugliest beanbag chair if you are in a pinch. Alright, this looks like an eyeball. Alright, so I'm just gonna say like, here's my beanbag chair. This is gonna be my base mesh that I'm going to sculpt on when I go in and like add detail and stuff to this. So ideally, I do tend to prefer sometimes I'll like model in like a little bit of cloth detail just to like give myself something to work with, but for now, this is what I'm doing. So this is like, if you're looking to like get away with like a week of like not a lot of heavy modeling, this would probably be the week to do it, but the sculpt should be nice looking. Ugly beanbag. Alright. So I'm going to sculpt this in ZBrush because I dislike sculpting Mudbox. I'll show you how to export stuff in both, but I'll do the quote-unquote nice sculpting in ZBrush, which is probably still going to be really questionable looking. Alright, so this is ZBrush. Come here. This is ZBrush. So this is what you get when you open it. For some reason it gets rid of the like start menu on the bottom of your screen, which drives me nuts. But yeah, this is the default stuff when you open it. Usually I just like ignore all of this stuff. This is just asking about like old files, if you've opened anything recently or whatever, and I'm just like, I literally never use this, so I just go up here and just hide that. We'll get rid of that. When you first open ZBrush, probably gonna want to import a model. If you start by default, so like this is just me left clicking and dragging, it's just putting in like a bunch of like random cubes, and this is like very much horrible. So if you go up on the right here, there's import export options, so I'll just hit import. I will find wherever the heck I put my where am I going? Projects, default. Apparently working on the default my file now. So I'll just grab my ugly beanbag, hit OK. And so it's not going to import it automatically. What you need to do is just left mouse button click and drag, and that will pop your object into the scene. It doesn't really matter if you import it like upside down. ZBrush doesn't really care. So you position it however you want. If you happen to want to snap into a particular orientation, you can just hold down Shift, and it'll snap it and just let you scale it. So I'm just going to dump that in there, call that good. Once you've done that, so if I go to click again, you'll notice it starts putting in another beanbag chair, which is not what I want. Up here, so here, the draw menu is basically saying like, draw in whatever thing you're importing. Just, you want to go through and click on edit, which for some reason is not letting me do that. That's super weird. That's bizarre. All right. For some reason, it's like locked out my edit tool. So I'm just gonna see what happens if I undo that. Okay, that was weird. So I just undid everything till it there was nothing in my scene, re-threw in my object, and now you can see that for some reason the edit tool has lit up. Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a bunch of different like subtools. Like ZBrush is crazy powerful. To be honest, most of the time I just use it for sculpting. But if you did want to do something where like you have, you know, a head with hair and like eyeballs in it and you want to do all that separately, usually what I'll do is like in Maya, I'll like pull the eyes out of the head, like move the hair off to the side, and then export all of that as an OBJ. So like if you import that OBJ, it's gonna have your model with like the head, exploded eyes, and like hair. And then you can draw on everything separately in ZBrush, and not worry about like accidentally drawing hairlines on the face. But yeah, whatever your OBJ or like whatever your file is, it's gonna throw that directly into ZBrush. Yeah. There's also ways you can like import multiple stuff separately. I just have never found a use to for any of this stuff. But yeah, so like usually I'll just like throw in like the one object that I'm working on and kind of call it a day. But yeah, so once you've drawn that object in, you want to go up and again just hit this edit thing. What that's going to do is allow you to actually modify the object instead of drawing in more hideous beanbag chairs. So if any of you happen to be following along at this point, I do want to go over a little bit of the basic navigation in ZBrush because it is very much different than Maya. And honestly, I am much better at ZBrush with a tablet than I am a mouse. But yeah, so the basic navigation of ZBrush. If you want to rotate around your object, pretty much either you could right or left click just anywhere outside your object. It doesn't super matter. And just drag your cursor around, that's gonna rotate your object. So again, right or left click anywhere not in your object is rotate. Pan is Alt and then the left mouse button outside of your mesh. That's just gonna let you, you know, scroll back and forth, whatever. So again, Alt left mouse button is pan. And if you need to zoom in on your mesh, it's Control and right click pretty much anywhere. And that's gonna, again, let you just zoom in on your mesh. ZBrush navigation is super awkward. Now that I think about it, there's probably a way where you can like manually set it up to behave like Maya, but whatever. So honestly, it takes like getting used to, especially if you're used to working in Maya. So you're probably just gonna like be flailing around wildly for the first like while that you're in ZBrush. Any question on the actual navigation? All right. They also kind of lay out their file stuff differently. Like in every other program I've ever seen, like the file edit menus are always right over here. For some reason in ZBrush, they just sort of put them like a third of the way into your menu. So like file is up here. Then you can like open documents from there, all that good stuff. Edit is basically just for undos and redos. ZBrush they let you go back like crazy far with your undos. Like it's really, you can go back like several hundred undos, I think. It's insane. It's really powerful. But they actually, to the point where like they actually made you a slider here, so you can just slider, if you've like, you need to go back like really far, you can just slider through your changes instead of hitting undo like 50 times. But yeah, so that's that. And then document is, if you ever need to make a new scene, it's Control N that you can usually do for like make a new whatever you're working in. For some reason it doesn't work in ZBrush, so again, if you need to make a new document, new document. And then the other thing that I noticed yesterday, which is super weird, so if you do document save as and file save as, they actually save two different types of files. Like I think file is like a ZBrush project, and then document will save like a ZBrush document. I'm not gonna lie, I use both kind of interchangeably. I have never really noticed a difference between them. Just be aware, like if you go to document open and try to open a ZBrush project, it's not gonna find it. Don't freak out, like your file is saved, just try the file open menu. I did that yesterday and I was like, oh my god, what have I done? Like I deleted all my stuff and it was just right there. I just was clicking on the wrong menu. So it's really, again, I don't know why they lay out their UI like that, they just did. Any questions on any of that? Alright. So the sculpting in ZBrush is very similar to sculpting in Mudbox. So I've never actually really paid attention to my wireframe in ZBrush, but you'll notice right now, like this is still a really like ugly low poly cushion. If I need to add more geometry to this, over on the right here, you'll see this like weird little menu thing. If you need to scroll, just click on the menu and drag it. Scroll bar is not going to work over here. Again, weird UI. But if you go to this geometry tab here, it'll pop down all of this good stuff. In this case, what you can just do is click on this ginormous button that says divide. And you'll notice when I do that, it adds more subdivisions to your mesh. So I'm just going to subdivide this a few times. The more you subdivide this, obviously the denser your mesh is going to be. Which, if you subdivide it enough, your computer's going to yell at you and be like, I don't have enough RAM for this, please stop. But yeah, so normally for something, like for a cushion or something, you probably don't need like crazy amounts of subdivisions. If your computer can handle it though, like the more subdivs you have, it is going to make a nicer looking sculpt. Or if you're doing something like really crazy, like a, I don't know, like really detailed like dragon head or something like that, you might actually need the more subdivs. So anywho, so once you have the divide subdivisions, once you've gotten this as smooth as you want it, you'll notice up here there is this little slider thing. This basically tells you how many subdivisions you have. So if the slider's all the way up, this is saying you have a max of, you've subdivided this model 5 times. So you can scrub through these, hang out on subdivision 2 if you want, etc., etc. There are a few other buttons. So like if I'm on subdivision 3 out of 5, this del lower and del higher button, this is saying delete all of the lower subdivisions and delete all of the higher subdivisions. Sometimes I actually accidentally click on delete lower. I don't necessarily recommend doing this. Like once you delete the subdivisions, there's no really way to bring them back unless you go through and like undo a bunch of changes. So if you like accidentally delete your lower subdivisions, do a bunch of work on your model and you're like, crap, I really need like subdivision 2 for something, you're probably gonna have to go back and undo all of the work you've done. So I usually don't use this. Sometimes if I've like broken my computer's RAM and I'm like, ooh, I subdivided this 12 times and decide I only need 6 subdivisions, you can just come back in and just do delete higher. And you can see it kind of resets the slider so that now when the slider is like fully subdivided, it's on subdivision 3 instead of 5. Does that make sense? Cool. Divide this higher. I'm going to go back and actually reset up this scene in a second. So this is just me mostly just like showing you guys like basic sculpting stuff, not necessarily how to export a displacement map. Because there's a few other steps for that, mostly just like, you know, get familiar with the program first. But yeah, so I think that's like pretty much all of the basic UI stuff. So at that point, they have a bunch of, like up here, if you look on the left here, you'll see they have a bunch of different brushes. They all kind of function differently. So standard brush is pretty much just think of like a hard or a soft brush in Photoshop. It's basically just a round thing. Up here on the top menu, you'll notice there is draw size, so you can adjust the size of your brush. Z intensity is, think of that a little bit like opacity, or like the more intense the Z intensity is, the more it is going to pull your sculpt off the surface. So like if I set this to 100, again, that's going to make a much more exploded line than the 60 and more exploded than like 20. Focal shift is basically just hardness of your brush. And you can shift this, you can actually shift this both directions. So shifting it to like -100 is going to give you basically like a perfect, really horrendous, grainy looking circle. Shifting it in is going to give you something, shifting it to +100 is going to give you something like whatever this horror is. That's questionable. But yeah, so I mean, again, just affects the brush differently. Incidentally, this is actually kind of an, I guess, interesting demo. This is pretty much what happens if you make a bump map with a hard edge. This is like more or less the effect that it'll give you a lot of times if you ever need to just draw that in for some reason. But yeah, so there's I guess a bunch of, I'll set this back to 0. If you right click on your mesh, it'll actually just pull up that little menu. It's kind of the same thing as it does in Photoshop. I'll set this to like 50. Honestly, I prefer doing it up here. I think it's easier. And if you just left click on these, it'll let you edit the values by manually typing in numbers, which a lot of times I think is easier. So there's a bunch of different brushes that you can use. Again, kind of the same thing as in Mudbox. You can just go through and like fiddle with them. Honestly, it's like the best way to do things in my opinion. So like this is Chisel. Works a little bit differently. It's like kind of like smoothing in Mudbox if you ever put that on. I'm really partial to clay and clay buildup for some reason. So instead of doing, so you can see this is like normal brush, this is Chisel, and this is clay buildup. It just sort of makes like a weird flattened lump, but it does allow you to sort of go through and like draw and like build up areas in a way that like I personally think is easy to deal with later. So again, I would say just like go through some of these and play with them. It's fun and you're totally gonna learn more by doing that than having me just like sit there and like randomly demo all the brushes. I will say polish is interesting. H-polish, it pretty much just like flattens whatever you're doing. So like if you've done something, you need to kind of like flatten it, like rub it down. You can go through and just like click on that, and you can see it kind of makes an interesting sort of hammered metal effect. Again, if you ever need to do that, you can. It's kind of fun. But yeah, so that's mostly just like the random brush things. Go back to my standard brush real quick. Any questions on any of that? All right. Why can I never find my standard brush? Come back here. All right. So really quick, so normally by default, if you're using your standard brush, ZBrush is going to add material onto your model. There are two ways. So if you want to have it indent instead of push your model out, there's two ways to do that. So if you hit up here, it's on Z add. So this is basically like make something raised. Z sub is going to push the brush in or like remove material from the surface. So again, Z add, Z sub. If you want to toggle between those, so like again, just be on Z add. If you hit Alt as you draw, it's going to reverse that. So if you're on Z add, hitting Alt, pressing and holding Alt is going to take you onto Z sub. Releasing the button is going to take you back onto add. So again, with Alt, without Alt. If you're on Z sub, so again, Z sub, I'll press Alt, and in this case, it's going to start adding material. That makes sense? Cool. Yeah. All right, go back to add. So the other thing, I usually don't really touch this like at all. But stroke, by default, it's set on dots, which for the most part does like a fairly reasonable job, I think. There's another thing that I found interesting that's drag dot, but I'll go over that in a sec. But yeah. So the other thing, again, really similar to Mudbox. Down here is this alpha channel. This basically changes how your brush, it's like changing the shape of your brush in Photoshop pretty much. So if I select like this weird flower thing, I'll make my draw size bigger. So you can see when I draw this on, it's going to punch this odd little flower shape into my mesh. It's kind of starting to look like a weird abstract head. So if I go over, you'll see, you will notice maybe like some of the lines here, like you can see a little bit of tessellation around the edges of this weird flower thing I've just added. So if you're gonna add like a lot of fine detail, you might need to go in and again, just like add a few more subdivisions. You'll notice when I do that, it becomes a lot smoother of a transition in there. So now if I draw a flower, it's much smoother than it was previously. And I can still toggle back and forth. So like right now I'm on subdivision 7 because I just added some more. I'll toggle back down to 2. And you can see that whatever changes I've made on my high resolution mesh are being reflected in the rough shape of the low mesh. It just looks kind of gross. So again, I'm just going to scrub back up to 7 and just sort of keep doing things. But again, so yeah, so there's a bunch of different alphas you can use. They have like these weird ones for scratches. Usually, many times, if I'm doing alphas for stuff, so like let me say, I'll go back to like these weird sort of swirly things. So I want to add this swirl in. Basically, all I'm doing to do this is I click, and then I drag. And the direction that I drag affects the positioning of the object that I'm adding. So in this case, here I'm just going to click and then drag down, and you can see that it's pointing the arrow downwards. If I click and drag left, it's going to point the arrow left. So based on the position, or like the direction you move your cursor after clicking, it's going to change the direction of your stamp, which is kind of hard to work with sometimes, honestly, but it's like really nice to be able to have the control to do that if you want to. So when I say click and drag, so if you guys are in ZBrush, like if you keep dragging, it's just going to repeatedly add in. It's actually kind of not bad if you ever just need to texture like a creepy caterpillar or something. Looks a little bit like a millipede, honestly, but so you just keep clicking and dragging. It's basically just going to overlap the stencil over and over, which is why if I'm personally stamping, a lot of times, again, I'll just click, drag until I get 1, and then I'll just release and just sort of manually add these in like wherever I need them. Because there's very few times that I actually want this effect and stuff that I'm doing. Let's see if I have any free space on this ball. So that's again a little bit where I said that so like again, stroke is usually set to dots by default. Spray is basically just going to, like if I click and drag, it just sort of like plops a random collection of that stencil on at once. It's a little bit harder to control, but if you do kind of want that like very random effect, you could use spray. The other thing I found that's quite helpful actually is drag dot. So that would be, so I click and I drag this, and then now as I drag my cursor, instead of just like adding more and more of these little triangles, it's actually letting me position this triangle wherever I want it. So if you're like laying in scales or something like that, you can go in and very carefully position these however you want. Like by doing this, again, you get a little bit more control over the placement of these weird triangles. Any questions about that? All right. And again, this is going to be the power of the undo. I'm just going to go back to the original document. So if I go to edit, you can see I've done like 75 things, and I'm just going to be like, haha, no, I haven't. I've only apparently subdivided this model twice now. And again, that's just like the edit and then the scrub thing, and then if I wanted to, I can go back forward. It's like really amazing. As soon as I start modifying this, it kind of breaks, like it can't go back to all the previous stuff I did, but the fact that I can just go back to the original of my model, even though I've done 75 changes, is kind of fantastic. All right, except in this case, I'm actually just going to start a new document. So are there any questions about like navigating ZBrush, like how to use the brushes, anything like that? All right. So in this case, I'm just going to start a new document. So this is, what I'm about to show you is the process of doing things when you want to export a displacement map for stuff. Where am I going? So I'm just going to go to Document, New Document. No, I do not want to save that. So again, it actually stashed my my little crappy chair in there. So I'm just going to click that, drag that into my scene, and go to Edit. Again, make sure that you actually hit Edit, otherwise it's going to keep adding random chairs into your scene. Alright, so again, this is process of doing things if you need to export a displacement map. There's a few pretty important settings that you need to choose beforehand. So the first thing, before you do anything, like as soon as you put your mesh in the scene, over in this right little menu bar here, you're going to want to go down to Morph Target. So again, Morph Target, just click the Store MT button. This is just store morph targets. It'll be more obvious what this does later in the process, but basically it saves a version of your model, of the original model that you've brought in before you start sculpting on it. Because remember when I sculpted on the model and then I was like, here's the lower subdivision, you can see there's like a bunch of lumps in it. So it's basically like changed the base mesh. You still need a copy of your original mesh in there, and doing the storing the morph target allows you to toggle back and forth between your original mesh and the low poly modified mesh. I have a whole document of the processes, whatever, going through pretty much anything I'm doing right now. I'll throw that on the student drive later, but yeah. So again, you need to store your morph target, and then you can go through and subdivide your model like you normally would. So I'm just going to go back up to 7 subdivs. And I will. So again, you can totally use ZBrush with a mouse. Obviously, I'm doing that right now. If you happen to have a tablet, again, not required, but if you happen to have one, it will work off pen pressure. So if you have a tablet, I would recommend using one, or if you have access to a tablet, because it does allow you to get like a little bit finer details with like a little bit less work, but it's again, certainly not a requirement. I realize not everyone has access to tablets. So in this case, I'm just going to go in and let me actually look up a reference of a beanbag chair really quick, because I have no idea what a beanbag chair looks like. All right. Away. All right. All right, so I'm just going to say this is like kind of maybe similar-ish to what I'm doing, I suppose. This is going to be really awkward. I'm not particularly great at sculpting cloth. But, so it looks like there's a seam in here. So like, if I'm doing cloth, again, I just like always really enjoy putting in seams. I think it makes stuff look awesome. And like in the real world, cloth things do have seams. It's like seams, some random wrinkles, mostly on the inside, maybe kind of on the bottom. So I might just go in. I probably should have flattened the bottom of my beanbag chair so it's not round. But I might go in and decide like, all right, this is maybe like not indented enough. So I'm just going to go in with my normal brush, press Alt, and just punch in the center of the chair a little bit. I'm going to go off of drag dot because that's dumb for what I'm doing. Wow, that's intense. Let me take my Z intensity down. So again, I'm just going to like kind of doodle around like a crazy person, punch in the center of this chair a little bit more. This is definitely something that like probably would be better done in the original model, but like you can do it in ZBrush if you have to. I think it's good to get the base mesh to be as close as you can. Like if there's any like major wrinkles or like major indents, it's good to actually model them in instead of just like say I'm going to do a beanbag chair and then start from a sphere like I'm doing right now. So like do that. And then I might just go in and fiddle around with some of the different. Interesting. I forgot they have a thing where you can add buttons and like. What? Oh, okay. All right, so I'm just gonna like fiddle around. They have like again some really weird stuff where you can like drag your mesh around pretty aggressively, which will destroy your geometry, but you can do it. But in this case, I'm just gonna see if I can find an alpha, maybe something like this, just sort of like lines and just sort of like. What am I doing? Oh, whoops. Go back to like I'll try clay. I don't know. Just see what different effects that gives me. I thought I selected alpha. And just go back in and like try to sculpt in some basic like cloth into this. Again, this looks really questionable. So I might actually just do some like really basic stuff on this and just sort of do like a how to export a displacement map and then show you for like something nicer looking. Something maybe using more stamps. So again, I'm just sort of like, oop. Oh yeah, that's the other thing I actually forgot to mention. So if you hold down Control while you're on your mesh, you can see hopefully you can see, it's changed the cursor to mask. So you can go in and like mask off certain areas. So if I make my brush size larger, I'll mask off this area. So now if I just go in regularly and try to draw on this, you can see that as I draw, it stops at the edge of that mask. If you ever need to get rid of your mask, again, just Control and Alt. So holding Control and Alt will let you erase pieces of your mask, so that then you can go back in and like draw on areas of your mesh. So if you're ever actually like accidentally doing stuff and you're like, oh no, what's this like weird grayed out area? It's a mask. Again, Control Alt and just color over it. It'll delete it. You can also never had a use for this, but you can if you need to do a marquee mask. So if I hit Control, click somewhere outside my mesh and just drag, it's going to marquee over like that entire selection of my chair. Again, not entirely sure why you'd want to do this, but if you have a use for it, let me know, because I'm actually really curious. But yeah. So let's just say maybe that I've, drawn in my stuff on the chair. I'll add just like a crappy seam and some like stitches on top of that seam. Gorgeous. Incidentally, if you're ever doing baseballs, this is like not a horrible way to add seams to them. But anywho. So I'll show you just like really quick how to export this, if for some reason this is like what you were happy with. Again, I actually find it really hard to sculpt cloth without using a tablet. I don't know why, it's like, the pressure sensitivity is like really helpful. You can do it without, it's just hard. Alright, so once you're ready to actually export your mesh, what you are going to want to do is go down. So first of all, if you look over again on the right, you'll see this little UV map thing here. Just make sure this is set to whatever size that you want for your final resolution. When possible, I like to export at 4K just because I'm like weird and paranoid. I'm gonna leave it at 2K because I don't want this taking forever. The next thing you're gonna do is actually set your geometry. So go back into your geometry tab where you subdivided your model. Take the slider and shove it all the way back down to one subdiv, which is your original mesh. And again, so you can see, it's like because I've added all these like horrific bulges on the side of this chair, it's actually modified the original mesh so that now there's like these weird lumpy things on it. So that's where the store morph target comes in handy. So if we go back under the morph target tab, what have I done? There should be a switch thing here, but apparently there's not. All right, really quick. All right, redoing this process again because apparently I undid my store morph target. So again, store morph target, subdivide model, sorry, doodle on model. Huzzah, gorgeous. This is a delightful displacement map. Kind of looks like a brain. All right, so once it's done, take your model back to subdivision 1. Again, you can see the original mesh is very much modified. And then you should be able to go down to your store morph target. And again, you'll see, now that I like didn't undo my store, this switch button will be activated. So you can, if you click this, it's going to toggle back and forth. So here's your original mesh, unsculpted, and the low-res sculpted mesh. So again, it is important if you want to. Was that a question? Yeah. Oh, so I think I hit store, and then when I went to switch it, the button was grayed out. So I think I like undid my store. So I just like undid everything really quick. Usually, a lot of times, because I'm like super paranoid, I'll like do a few things and then like check to make sure that my store exists. If you do delete it, it's not like the end of the world. Like if you spend hours on a model, you just might need to export the new base mesh. So basically, what the store morph target is asking is, like when you export the displacement, it's going to export it for this mesh, for your original mesh. If you forget to store your original mesh, or like your store doesn't go through, what you can do is export this new lumpy map, and it'll just make the displacement map for this. So if you re-import this into Maya and put the displacement map on that, it'll show up correctly. Sometimes, honestly, it like doesn't cause a huge issue, but it's just like a weird thing where like if you do have like a really specific mesh that you want saved for some reason, like it has good topology for animating or something like that, you definitely want to use the store morph target, because sometimes this can like make weird overlapping geometry stuff, if that makes sense. That kind of answer your question? Cool. All right. So I'm just gonna, again, I'll switch back to my original mesh. And at this point, I am pretty much ready to actually export this displacement map. So there's a little tab down here for displacement map. Click on that. The features that you want. So adaptive, usually I don't use this. It makes the displacement map like a little bit nicer, adds like a little bit more detail, but it also takes like way longer to render. And I don't find for the most part that the detail is worth that extra time. So if you export your map and it's like showing up completely horribly and you're like, why? You could try an adaptive one, but again, usually I don't tend to use this. Smooth UV, you want to check if the mesh that you're putting this on is going to be smooth. So like if you're using the 3 key to smooth your model, you would want to check this option on. If you're doing a low poly game mesh or just like anything low poly, you actually wouldn't need this. It just like lays out things a little bit differently in the UVs to compensate for stretching when you smooth your model. Flip V. So for the life of me, I don't know why. ZBrush pretty much will export your texture upside down if you don't click this. Not the end of the world, you can just flip it in Photoshop, but like usually you'll need to click this flip V button, and that'll actually flip it so it exports properly for your UVs. 3 channels is just basically just like storing things as RGB values. So I will usually click this on. I just find it works better. Like I have less errors sometimes if I use this. So I'll do 3 channels and then always export 32-bit. It's going to give the computer more information to actually use in your texture file, which is going to make your maps look much nicer. Other things you want to set up are take this DP sub pix, displacement sub pixel accuracy. I usually take that up to 4. And then the other thing, so I'll actually, sure. 5. All right, cool. So I'm just going to export this really, really quick. So you can see that it is, half the time this timer is like hideously inaccurate, but it's just sort of slowly going through and exporting the displacement map for me. Usually if you do 32-bit, it's going to, from ZBrush it'll ask you to do either a TIFF or an EXR. I don't really care which one you use, to be honest. I usually use TIFFs just because you can at least open them in default image viewers, which is like a stupid reason to use them, but there it is. So when I export this, I'm usually like crazy paranoid and I like won't touch the computer while ZBrush is exporting maps. Mostly because I am used to just doing really, really high poly stuff that does take 40 minutes and I don't like that crashing. So I'm just gonna hang out here and wait for a second. But the other thing that you're going to want to do, and I'll show you guys how to actually access this, but I wanted to show you what the map looks like. So ideally you should set this little mid thing here to 0, like this mid slider, but you'll notice that it's grayed out. Basically what this is doing is it's saying, that's controlling the background color. So like remember when I was talking about bump maps earlier, I was like, just go in, make a 50% gray background, and just do everything on top of that. Mid is basically doing the same thing. It's controlling how light or dark that gray background is. So by default, it's set to 0.5, which is going to be 50% gray. 0 is going to be black, and then white is going to be 1. So again, usually this is set to 0. To actually access this is taking longer than my laptop to export a map, and I was doing nice things on my laptop. Just throwing that out there. But anywho, so normally to access this, and again, I'll go over this in a sec, but you would just apply an alpha to this. You just click on this and it'll bring you a little drop down. Put anything into it, like any random alpha. It should give you access to the slider, which you can then set to 0, and then just get rid of the alpha and re-export your map. So mercifully, I think this maybe is possibly almost done. Are there any questions on anything I just went over? Yes? I'm sorry? So I'm actually, one of the reasons I'm exporting this map, I'll show you in a sec. But basically, displacement maps work a little bit differently-ish. And sometimes if it's set to mid, it'll explode the crap out of your model. And basically, like, if you... Instead of, like, mid being do nothing to the model, it'll be like, oh, you want that moved out, like, half the distance of the max displacement, right? So it'll just be like... and just make everything, like, crazy puffy. It lives! It's done. Alright, so once it's exported this map, usually it'll ask you if you want to export the base mesh as well. So the base mesh is the that sort of modified lower subdivision mesh, that like basically lumpy original mesh I made. So this is, you would definitely want to do this if you didn't have your morph target saved. So I'm just gonna hit yes. Okay. Apparently it's just naming it something random in a place. That's helpful. Alright, so if I go into my folder where I've stashed all this stuff, not unbox. Scenes. So here's my ugly beanbag, and oh, glorious. So here's the really ugly displacement map it's made. Nothing like particularly interesting here, but and then you can see, so mid 5 OBJ is the new mesh that it's made. So if I throw that into Maya, so here's my original beanbag chair, and then here's, oh I see, it was exporting. That's stupid. All right, sorry. So if you export that, when you're using store morph target, it is actually just going to export the original mesh again. If you do need to go through for some reason and export your other mesh, so I'm just going to switch this. So you can see here's my gross lumpy version. You can go up to here and just do export lumpy chair. And that should save that. And then if I were to throw in this lumpy chair OBJ, it actually imports the lumpy chair. So again, if you don't switch between your morph targets, like you don't save your morph targets, you would want to export this OBJ, and then this is what you would apply your displacement map to. So I'm just going to go through, throw an Arnold, random crappy light. It's gonna be super ugly. All right. Wow, that is so ugly. Actually, one thing, so while I happen to be here with lighting stuff, if you guys ever happen to render stuff with a Skydome light and find that, like, there's clearly an indent in here with some shadow, but it's not showing up, it is probably because there's nothing mapped into the background, into the light, and these do give really, really flat lighting. So I'm just going to go in and throw in my random HDR that I've just sort of like stashed on this computer. And you can see that as soon as I do that, it actually has like less disgusting lighting. This is incidentally one of the reasons why I was like, please, at least if you're going to use a Skydome light, put it in an HDR, because the other ones give really flat lighting, and this just makes everything look a little bit more realistic and polished. Anywho. So again, if you need to throw in a displacement map into your object, and this first step is pretty much the same between Arnold, Redshift, same way to do things. So I'm just going to assign this a new material, and random standard surface shader. So I'm going to go into my hypershade, and I am going to look for, crud. Alright, so I'm just going to go into my hypershade. This is the new surface shader I made, so I'm just going to expand that down here. I will click on this little blue standard surface shader thing. You can see I have the displacement material. And I'm just going to map in the file from that, which I think was saved in my scenes folder because ZBrush is stupid. Where am I going? Scenes. All right, so here's my like midpoint 5 TIFF. And you can see like when that renders, it's a little bit weird looking. Probably would have helped if I actually UV'd this object, but you can see that. So like when I apply this to the mesh, it kind of just like expanded the entire mesh. Like, this isn't really what my zebra sculpt looked like, kind of at all. So one thing you can do to go back in and sort of help with that is if you click on your shape node here and go down under Arnold, this little tab here, scroll all the way down, there should be a tab called Subdivision. And this is probably not necessary for like this particular mesh, but I'll go over like why this is helpful with a slightly nicer example in a few seconds. So set this for type of subdivision, set that to Cat Clark. That's just Catmull Clark smoothing. There's different math equations that they use to smooth your models. This is the one that Maya and most programs use. So just do that, and then also if you're working with like a really, really high resolution, like you're adding scales onto a face or something like that, you might need to set the number of iterations up higher, and that'll just give you a little bit more resolution around the edges of your mesh to work with. But in this case, the texture looks kind of funky, just because of the way that I exported the map. So again, I'm going to go down to displacement map, and I'm going to set mid down to 0. So again, to do that, I'm just going to select this, add in any random alpha. You can see that I now have access to this mid slider, set it to 0, and get rid of this weird alpha. I actually have no idea what this alpha does. It's just the thing that I use to access mid. And as soon as I get rid of that, it's gotten rid of my map. So I'm just going to create an export, mid pt0. Sure. All right, and this is still going to take forever and a day to export, which is delightful. However, hopefully it won't crash when I do things. So this actually weird subdivision thing, I was actually curious. So I looked at this and I was like, I bet this is doing a specific thing. Remember my whole spiel on the first week of class, like, don't make me rectangular chicken nuggets. Like, if you want a circle, don't start with a rectangle, and just hit 3 and expect it to look nice. You can kind of fudge it a little bit with this, actually. So if I'm just gonna add in a glorious cube here. I will hit the 3 key, and you'll notice that it still looks disgusting along the edges. Holy crap. Alright, hang on. It saves all my tabs on the other monitor, and I have to find them again. Alright, there we go. So you'll notice here is my weird little cube thing that I've just added. Again, still looks kind of gross. Yeah, like the edges are all like polygony and icky. So if I just go in here, I will select this cube, and I am going to set subdivisions to Cat Clark. You'll notice that already makes it much nicer looking. And then if I wanted to, I could set the iterations up to like 3, and that makes it pretty much smooth like a perfect sphere. Again, if you need a sphere, make a sphere. But if you were ever like in a position where you were doing like that little grate thing that I did where you like booleaned a bunch of rectangles together, and you were basically making like a lot of little circular holes from square holes, if you needed to get close to that, you could sort of just turn on smoothing here and like fudge it like it would render nicer. Be aware, I tried doing this on my laptop, if you set this to like 6, it's gonna boost your render time like a whole lot. I found 3 is like probably all I need, but again, just like weird, interesting things that you can do if you fiddle with some settings. Any questions on that? All right. Basically what this is doing is saying how many times do you want this model subdivided? How much like fake geometry do you want added to this for the overall like rendered effect? You'll notice like it still looks like crap in the actual smooth version in like the viewport. It just renders a little bit nicer. So again, render time thing, not viewport Maya thing. Oh my god, no. All right, for the record, this is why I don't touch the computer when it's exporting maps. All right. Well, that's fun. That's kind of annoying. Anyway, let me, oh, that's what okay. All right. So here we have, again, ZBrush. So it asked me, there's a little pop-up and it's like, oh, you have like a quick save. You have like a bunch of quick save stuff. So every like 5 or 10 minutes, it'll sort of auto-save files for you. In this case, it does seem to have my most updated version of this horrific sculpt I've done. So I should be able to go through, it saves my morph targets, seems to have caught pretty much all of my displacement map stuff. So I'm just going to reset the mid slider to 0. Again, just by adding an alpha, and then I'll just get rid of that alpha because I don't know what the heck that does. All right. So I'm just going to re-export this and wait for a few minutes and not try to use the computer. It does make me a little slow. I was like, oh great, like my laptop is really slow. Like the computers in here will be faster. Takes 5 times as long on this computer than my laptop. But does anyone have any questions about any of the ZBrush stuff we've went over? Like any other things that don't involve a computer demonstration to answer questions on? All right. Basically, I just want to show you guys the difference on something relatively simple between the 2 different settings of that mid value. There's ways to sort of like take it and fiddle with it in Maya. Basically, you could just adjust the levels of it so it doesn't like explode your mesh. I just find it's better practice in general. Like, if you have your texture maps correct, you can use them in any software. If you like go into Maya and start playing with the levels of your stuff, and then you want to say export that to a game mesh or something like that, the modifications you've done with like slider values to that displacement map aren't going to follow through, which is again why I just sort of recommend doing things correctly in your maps where possible. I love how this is the slowest computer in the room. Let's see, any other interesting things? So I'll give you guys a more, once this stupid thing exports, I have a weird sculpt I made with just like the head model that I did, that I'll show you guys, because it's a little bit more tangible with the, that thing where you like select the Catmull-Clark subdivisions and like add subdivs. Because that was like, I basically just added scales all over the face. So that was like a lot more detail where it actually needed that extra information to be able to render it correctly and like have it be the correct shape. This is the simplest displacement map ever. Dang. Anyway. All right, anywho. So while this is doing things, your assignment this week, some of you guys have already done it, but this is the week where you're officially picking teams for your finals. So again, if you haven't already picked your teams, just let me know. It should be groups of 3 to 4 people for each project. And again, if A&M kids, you need to do like high poly stuff because that's like your major. But if you're like game, I don't think I have any CS kids, but if you're a group of like all game students or like game students, CS students, you're welcome to do low poly meshes and render them in a game engine should you so choose. My map is done, huzzah. So you can see here, basically just more or less the same map, just the background is black. So let me, how glorious is that? All right, so I'm gonna go back into my surface shader and just find my displacement file. See if I can just change that to 0. So you'll notice like when I change that to midpoint 0, it does behave a little bit better. What was my actual sculpt like? This looks weird to me. I think it just exported for some reason really badly. Basically, this is like kind of actually a weird example because it didn't export the file correctly, but you can see here it's at least not like exploding my model out to the ends of the render. So again, this is the version with like the 0.5 for a midpoint. So basically that 0.5 is just saying take the entire mesh and like stretch it outwards, which is why it is kind of exploding like this. And then the other thing I just want to bring up like super quick, so if you guys ever need to, where is it? Fine. If you guys ever need to, for some reason, adjust the scale of your displacement maps, you can find that here. So if you're in your hypershade, this little displacement shader 1 shows you where you can map in your file, and also it does give you the scale thing here. So if I set this to something like 3, like a crazy person, okay, maybe like 1.5. So you can see it kind of, Maya kind of clamps your object, and it's like, you can't displace it past this point, like this is ridiculous. There's a setting you can use to fix that if you are ever doing like a really intense displacement map. So again, still in this displacement shader, if you go down to Arnold, this little Arnold tab, you'll see bounds padding, and I'll usually just fiddle with that. Like if I set that to 1, usually it'll make the displacement map actually render correctly and like not have any of that weird clipping that it did before, where it was sort of flattening the sides of this object. But yeah, so that's a weird example of a displacement map. Let me run through really quick. On my Google Drive, like I said, I have like a slightly nicer example of displacement maps. Oh no. Well, that's a bummer. Okay. All right. Well, I have pictures of the nicer displacement maps that I did. I may have overflowed an aquarium this morning and kind of been rushing out the door and forgot to upload the files. Cough. But, so here's like a few renders that I did. This is like the sculpt that I did earlier today. And this is basically just toggling back and forth between smoothing and no smoothing. So like having that little Catmull Clark thing selected versus not having it. So this is the displacement map just by default. There's no additional smoothing. You'll notice that some of the shadows are a little bit harsh, especially in the areas of darker scales in here. If I toggle to 1 level, so this is with smoothing and just one layer of subdivision, and you can see some of those dark shadows are like a little bit, a tiny bit like less aggressively shadowed. But especially like if you look, it's more obvious like right here along these sort of side scales on the head. So 1 level of subdivision, 3 layers of subdivision. And you can see that it's really, adding that extra subdivision does, it's lightening the shadows. This is much closer to what the original ZBrush sculpt looked like. But it's also giving a little bit of extra resolution. In the same way like that weird smoothing demo I did with the sphere, it's giving a little bit of additional resolution to the edge of that mesh, which allows it to better capture the details in the scales. Cannot possibly take that long to zip 3 images. Did I really like not save any of this? Oh wait. Ahaha, I have my ZBrush sculpt. That's exciting. Well this, I don't know. I was gonna try to like export a thing and it just sort of not doing. I don't have the images, that's not gonna be helpful. All right. If you guys, I guess, if you guys ever need to open a file, just go File, Open. I'm not gonna save this because it's weird, quite hideous. So you'll see it's looking for ZPR files if I do open. What I have is like a ZDoc file, like it's like a ZBrush document file. So I'm just gonna cancel that. And if I go to Document Open, under Downloads, you can see that it actually shows up there. So again, if you're ever like looking for your file and you're like, oh my god, where is it? Try the other open option. Are you kidding me? Document. For some reason I found like once it grays out the little edit thing, it just like never brings it back, which is irritating. Anyway, whatever. Seriously? I found ZBrush to be like one of the fiddliest programs. Like if I open it on my computer, because I have an actual license of it, like if I open it and then I do anything to it, it pretty much just like crashes the program. But you can see here's my sculpt. Okay, so this is literally just, that's not helpful. All right. But it has zipped my images, so I can at least zoom in on these better. But yeah, so I don't know. I'm sorry I forgot to like upload the actual files, but like does the stuff I'm saying like make sense with like how to smooth things and what have you? Okay. So again, like if you ever upload your files or you throw in your displacement map and it looks super weird, TIFFs and EXRs do tend to automatically check alpha's luminance and sort of auto-select the settings that they need for that. But if you do ever find that, again, it's like clipping off part of the head, just look for that little setting under that Arnold tab under your displacement shader where you can actually set that like clamping thing and it'll, you know, unclip your model basically. And if you ever find like the details aren't quite showing up the way you expect, that is somewhere where you would want to look into adding more subdivisions in. So again, this is one subdivision and, oh my god, no subdivisions. No subdivisions, no smoothing. You can see there's like pretty much no scale detail on the side of the head. And 3 subdivisions worth of smoothing, and you do get like a bunch of nice scale detail in here. So that's like pretty much how you normally import displacement maps. I wish I had like an actual nicer displacement map to put in. But yeah. So if you happen to be in Redshift doing things, because I said I was actually going to go over that. So I'm just going to load Redshift real quick. Give it a minute. But basically you load things the same way, where you just go into your hypershade, add your map into your displacement shader. So I'm going to go get rid of this, get rid of this. So I'm going to switch this over to a Redshift material. And again, for Redshift, you just use just the Redshift material is just the default material that they have there. I'll make this blue for no apparent reason. And then for Redshift lights, if you're ever looking to add in a dome light, just click on the little Redshift tab up here, go down to lights, and throw in a dome light. And it'll ask you to map in your file, which I stashed under downloads. And you can map that in. Thing I like, so if I go into my Redshift render view, it'll render that. I kind of like when it'll actually like display the, like you can see it's rendering the background, just like not displaying the background, just like kind of a bummer sometimes, but whatever. So the thing about Redshift, just like really quick, in case I haven't mentioned this, for some reason it defaults to making everything crazy shiny and crazy reflective. I really don't know why it does this. But like if I throw in this plane here, assign this the new Redshift material. Again, it just makes everything like really reflective, and it takes forever to render that way. Like I don't know why it defaults to this. So usually, first thing I do when I make a material is just like make it a little bit rougher. You can see it's like way faster to render like that. But anywho, but same basic principle for mapping in a displacement map. Again, I'm just gonna go into my hypershade. I'm gonna hit this little like square button with stars in it. It's gonna clear out all the crap that was down here. I will find my Redshift material, expand it, click on this, and I'm just going to throw in a noise texture for grins, because it's here. So I will throw in that noise texture on the displacement. Now Redshift is kind of annoying where like it literally won't actually render your displacement texture at all, unless you go in and like tell the object to displace. So again, this is a thing you do in your shape nodes. If you select your object, let's go into the shape node, go down to Redshift, and here you can see there's a little drop down. This time it's called displacement. Just enable displacement, and you can see that it will then explode your model with the beautiful noise texture you have put on. So if you're ever wondering, like again, like, oh my god, why isn't this working? Make sure this little displacement tab is checked on. If you're so inclined, you can also change the scale of your displacement, which I don't necessarily recommend doing per se. But I mean, if you did want to like make the displacement a little bit less freakishly aggressive, you could potentially play with that. I think this would also be a good area where you could play with like the max displacement. So if I set this, I'm going to see what happens if I set this like 0.5. And that might start doing like a little bit of that weird sort of clamping thing as before. Oh no, okay, no, yeah, sorry. That'll actually basically just cap the max value of your displacement. So even if you set your displacement up higher, it's only going to displace 0.1 units from your mesh. So at some point, I mean, if you take this low enough, it basically would start functioning like a bump map, where like even if you like get up to the sides of that, and you can see it's like not really displacing at all because I have this set so low. There's really no reason I can think to do that, but you can if you want, I suppose. So again, you will usually I don't need to play with these. Just be aware, like if you set your displacement scale higher than your maximum displacement, it's going to make it basically like a round ball, just like a slightly larger round ball. Because you like scale to 325, it can only go out to 1 unit, and it's like, well, I'm still capping this at 1 unit. So it just makes it a slightly puffier bump mapped ball, basically. Any questions on that? All right. I find bump mapping in Redshift actually to be a little bit easier. You do just need to remember to go through and like enable the bump map. So again, like the ground plane and the little beanbag thing here do have the same material on them. I just like have not enabled this for bump mapping or for displacement mapping. If I do, oh my, that's awful. But yeah. So I mean, if you ever need to like use the same texture with like the same properties and have a displacement on one but not the other, you could conceivably do that by just like telling one to not displace. I don't necessarily recommend doing that, but you could if you just like wanted a quick, easy way to do stuff. So any questions on that? All right. Really quick, I'm going to go over how to export a displacement in Mudbox. This time I will not use the this awful little beanbag chair. Mudbox. And then after that, this is like honestly pretty straightforward. I'm gonna use, if anyone wants to follow along, I am gonna use this like weird head model that I have, which is on the Google Drive in Student Resources. Where am I going? Basic VJs. It's just like the self-caricature, low poly, UV head only. I just like this file. Alright, so this is again, so when you open Mudbox, it's not going to let me drag it to screen, but it'll let you open a file. So in this case, I'm just going to go to my downloads folder, grab this file, and throw it in. Cool. So you can see that this exists here. Alright, so I'm going to go into my sculpting tools. I'll spin my model around. So this is the face I'm working with. So there's a similar process that you need to go through for, like when we did the store morph target thing in ZBrush. There's a similar way you kind of have to fudge that in Mudbox. In this case, if you go to your object list over here, you can see here's my head. So I'm just going to rename this as Ridge Head. I'm going to duplicate this. Just right click and just do duplicate object. I'm going to rename this as Sculpt Head. Basically what this does is like how the store morph target was like, here's a copy of your object. I literally just made a copy of my object. In this case, I don't really need to see this, so I'm just going to click on this little circle thing next to it. It'll hide the original head. And then I can select my sculpted head and do Shift-D to add some glorious subdivisions to this. So I'm just going to do like a really, and you can see, if you expand this, you can actually see all the different subdivision levels you have here. And I usually just click on default material or like anywhere not, I hate having this yellow, I find it very distracting, so I'll just click anywhere outside of the object list and it'll just go back to showing you like an actual material stuff. So I'm just gonna go in and like really quick just sculpt on, I don't know, what if I added like veins to my head? Oh god. So if you guys ever need symmetry, I don't think I mentioned this, but if you guys ever need symmetry, it's under mirror, under the, like, by the brush options. It'll show you where it's adding the plane. So I'm just gonna turn on symmetry X. And maybe just be like, okay, that's clearly too large. I very much, all right, this is terrifying. Holy actual crap. All right, so I'm just gonna say that maybe this is kind of what I wanted, or something. Go in and like add some little spiky things to my head just to like make the displacement more obvious. Awesome. Now I'm like leaf Klingon, sort of. All right, so if this is like your sculpt and you are happy with this actually makes me really uncomfortable. Basically what you're gonna wanna do is just go down. So I'm gonna hide the sculpted head that I did, and I unhid the original head. So I'm gonna take this and I actually subdivide it down to the level of the other one. So I think I had 4 subdivision levels. So if I have 4 subdivs on my sculpted model, I want 4 subdivs on my original model. And then the rest is like pretty straightforward. So what you just do, all you do is go into UVs and maps, extract texture maps, and just do new operation. In this case, I just want a displacement map. So here basically what it's asking for is the target model. So like in this case the original mesh, or like from the beanbag chair, is like that original ugly beanbag chair that I made in Maya. So I'm just going to select, with my original head selected, I'll do add selected, or click on the subdivision level, add selected. So again, target model you want to be your original head, and you want it set to the highest subdivision level that it has. So in this case 4. So if I just click on this, it'll pull up that little drop down where you can reselect the levels. For the source model, the source is basically like, where is it getting the sculpt information from? So in this case, you want sculpt head, level 4. Yeah. In terms of the settings you want for the rest of this, you don't usually need to fiddle with a lot of them. So smooth source models is, again, if you're going to use the 3 key to smooth your model in Maya, you are going to want this selected, or else the map tends to not display as well. For method, set that to subdivision. It's usually just goes a little bit faster, and for most times it'll get the job done. Image size, I don't know why they would set that to 1K. I usually do 2K. Anti-aliasing you can turn on or off. For sometimes I just like forget to turn it on and don't notice a huge difference, honestly. But if you want it, you can set it there. And for map type, I just leave that as texture. PTEX, unless I'm going crazy, PTEX is you can export like OBJ models or FBX models with vertex color. So like each vertex will have a color on it. That's what a PTEX file is. That's only really useful for something like very specific instances. If you're ever looking to upload something to Shapeways to print in full-colored sandstone, 3D print in full-colored sandstone, you could use that. But in this case, just stick to texture. And then for bits per channel, again, I'm going to set this to 32. And that's pretty much just going to automatically limit me to saving this as a TIFF or an EXR. And again, I usually just use TIFFs because I'm lazy. Modbox export. Why are you saying PNG? So I'm just going to do TIFF 32 and save that. And I'll just hit extract. What? Okay, fine. What? I absolutely UV'd that. I know it has UVs. Alright. 5 seconds. I'm actually curious and now doubting if my model has UVs, which is dumb because I know it does. Incidentally, I'm just going to treat this as this is why you should totally UV your objects. Haha. Now with the self-character head. Because I literally UV'd this morning. It has UVs. God dang it. That's why. All right. That's so stupid. All right, new plan. Sometimes, if this doesn't work, I will literally just like try slightly different settings, which is questionable. So again, I'm gonna basically reset up what I had before, except I'm just gonna see what happens if I leave original head at level 0. Don't smooth this. Again, subdivisions, 2K image, turn on anti-aliasing, and 32-bit test. And hopefully this works. Alright. Weird. Instantly it's like, the first error message was yelling at me for a star in my model, and my theory was like, well, if I subdivided that star would get more dense, so maybe if I just like choose the original model, question mark, it would leave my, vertice not exploded. So you can see here's the, once I exported that, here's the displacement map that it's kicked out. So I should be able to go back in and just throw that into Maya. I'll just make this a new material, redshift. So again, you can see, again, this is like a pretty low poly head. I'm actually curious to see what happens because I didn't make this for a smooth model, so I'm curious to see what happens when I toggle between smooth and unsmooth. Anywho, I'm gonna throw in my displacement map really quick. You can also navigate to it through these like little menu things up here, should you so choose. Source images. All right. So this is what it was doing this morning to me. All right, where am I going? So this is still material. I'll try to shift render view. See what happens. Alright, so again, I should need to go through and just check on displacement under that little Arnold tab. And you can see that it's somewhat questionably smoothed my model. You see the displacement doesn't look terribly great. So like this, compared to my, my mudbox sculpt, which like clearly there's like much more protrusions coming out of the head here. Zebra sculpt, go away, I'm done with you. So again, you can see like it's not really coming up the way I would want or expect. So there are a few settings that you can tweak for that. Shape mode, redshift, name displacement. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's what it was. So I'm just going to take maximum displacement and set that to like something like 4. Doesn't seem to help all that much. And you can play with the max displacement here if you want to. Displacement map, render stats, display. Where was it? Sorry, there's like a weird thing for redshift somewhere. I'm going crazy. It could actually just be, oh, no, that's actually why it looks terrible. So, all right, so I forgot about that. So when I exported my map, I did it for a not smooth model. So this is apparently what it looks like on a low poly mesh. If I smooth it, it does look a little bit nicer, which is actually interesting. It usually breaks it, but again, difference between smoothed and unsmoothed apparently there. So any questions on exporting maps from Mudbox? All right. I mean, clearly it's like a little bit forgiving with the, like if you switch different settings. Ideally, you would use the settings that I originally gave, which was like exporting everything. Like if your mesh is smooth, export the mesh for a smooth mesh, that kind of thing. But in a pinch, you can do it for, you can not do that and still have it look relatively decent, even though it's like kind of exploded some of the mesh down here. But yeah. So any questions on any of that displacement map stuff? All right. So again, for your assignment this week, basically I've just been going through and using either Mudbox or ZBrush. If you want to use like a different comparable program that you're familiar with, just email me and let me know what that program is. It's probably fine. and you're just going to make some kind of like cushion or something that needs fine sculpting detail in it. Oh, the other thing, so I closed off ZBrush, but you can import your own meshes and brushes into ZBrush. It's way easier than doing it in Mudbox. You can do it in Mudbox, but like right under the alpha thing, go away, too many menus. So right under alpha here, if you just click on this, you'll see a little import button. If you click on that, you can basically import like any black and white TIFF image into your ZBrush, and it'll let you stamp with that image. So if you're ever on something like textures.com and you find like these sculpting brushes here for like say this rock texture. So like here's the map. If you download this, you can just import it straight into ZBrush and make pretty reasonable looking like rock textures or whatever other textures you need. So if you ever did need any kind of like, you're doing like some fancy molding and you needed, you know, molding textures or something like that, or you were doing rock, stuff that's like not standard with ZBrush or Mudbox, you could just make your own textures and import those, stamp them directly on the objects. I really like rocks because rocks are the worst thing ever to model, but yeah. So again, pretty easy in ZBrush. You just go through and just click on this and do import, find your image, and it pretty much just imports it by default. It's quite lovely. Where am I going? Sorry. I amassed far too many things. All right, so again, so the goals, I guess, for the sculpting detail assignment, I don't necessarily care what your base mesh looks like, since you'll be using a displacement map. Ideally, again, if you're doing a cushion or something, it might be good to like model in some of the creases on the side just to like get an idea of where you want to crease things. But if you wanted to just like start with a cube, you could, I suppose, or like a, you know, a slightly rounded cube for like a cushion kind of thing. You could start with like something really simple. Just make sure like whatever you do, your render should be like sitting on the ground, or like your object should be actually sitting on the ground, which is again just a little bit easier if you start with like something closer to the shape you want, because you can actually position the mesh instead of guessing where it is based on the displacement amount. And then I would like to see as much sort of fine detail added in as you can. So if you're doing, if you happen to go with like the face, if you ever look at a face, there's like, you know, little hairs, like maybe some stubble, but like little hairs, eyebrows, like pores, stuff like that. That kind of stuff would definitely show up. So if you guys are doing, if you guys do want to use that like weird default head I did, which is the one I just sculpted a like weird sort of leaf face on, it should be already set up for UVs and stuff. You're welcome to try to like do an old age sculpt, turn the person into like a weird like crone with like warts or something, like turn like a witch or something like that. Like I don't, like do something interesting. Just try to get it as detailed and realistic as possible. If you're doing something like a cushion, you could go in and add in detail. So like sculpt in, again, a bunch of additional folds, like additional wrinkles. Stitches are really good to do. So once you got all that detail sculpted in something like ZBrush, then you could go in if you wanted to and add in a bump map. So a lot of times, like I'll use sculpting to get in main details, like if you wanted large wrinkles in a cushion, and then I'll use a bump map to go in and be like, leather texture, I don't need to worry about like sculpting this in ZBrush, just here's a bump map with like a leather texture. Basically give me the most high detail, realistic cushion, face, piece of fruit, etc. that you possibly can. Again, you can do, originally the assignment was pieces of fruit, so if you want to do a piece of fruit, you're welcome to do that as well. Citrus works well because it's really heavily textured on the outside. So any last questions on the sculpting detail assignment? All right. Basically, again, shoot for as much detail and as realistic detail as you can possibly get for this. That's really what I'm shooting for, is like try to make nice realistic detail. All right. For the other assignments, so again, you should be picking teams for your final projects. Fairly straightforward, I suppose. Again, 3 to 4 people. Make sure, please, that each member of the team emails me the team list. Or not emails, submits me the team list on Blackboard Learn. I mostly just like want to make sure that like everyone has a team. It's also just easier for me to grade if I can just not have to go through and like find everyone's assignment and like rename it. If you have trouble finding a team, let me know. I know probably like not everyone knows everyone, in which case I can help you like find a team. I don't hate the idea if you guys want to, if you guys like know people in the other sections of my class, if you want to sort of team up and do group with like other people in other sections, I don't hate the idea. Just be aware that like some of the, like, especially if you choose someone from like tomorrow's class, the deadlines might not match up and you're gonna have to sort of like work with that. But yeah, I don't hate the idea, just like be aware it might be kind of maybe more effort than you want, but again, I'm not opposed to that. Any questions on the teams for the final? Alright. So in addition to forming teams, I would also like you guys to get a jump on doing some actual like pre-production stuff, like deciding as a team on the different scenes you're going to be doing for the final. So once you've chosen your team, again, if you have trouble finding teammates, let me know. You're going to basically decide on a theme for your final. And this is as a group. So decide on a time period, find some images that like help represent the period and like the style of pieces. If for some reason I default to like Victorian toy shop, you might want to find some like Victorian dolls or like Victorian furniture, like workspaces, tools, stuff like that. Maybe just like rooms in general. That sort of capture the look and feel of the objects that you're going for. And then that's the idea behind this, is that you have a sort of cohesive set of images to work with as a team that you can refer back to, so that the styles of whatever you make are similar to each other. Because again, you're gonna be making images and like sharing them among your team members. So if one is like a completely different style, it's gonna look really, really weird and out of place. Does anyone have questions on what the actual final is for the class, by the way? Kind of remember. Okay. Summary of what final is basically is just you're going to form teams of people, decide on some kind of like workshop or space that you're going to be making. I don't necessarily care if it's a workshop. I'd be fine with just like a dining room or something like that. Basically like, pick a room. And you're going to select a time period for that room. The only requirement is that it cannot be future times. It should be either present or like past, so you actually have like photographic reference to refer to when you're actually modeling things. So again, you decide that as a team. Each person is going to model 3 objects. One hero object, one main object, one piece of furniture, and one random decorative object that all make sense within the room that you've chosen, as well as the time period and style that you've chosen. And then, so for the final project, you're all going to share those 3 objects among your teammates. So if you have a 3-person team, each person is making 3 objects. You're going to have 9 objects to start with to populate your scene. And then each person is individually responsible for laying out the space, deciding how it's lit, how it's going to be textured, what other stuff is there. So basically you're making an entire environment and 3 objects, and then just sort of like taking objects from your teammates and putting them in as additional stuff. Does that make sense? Cool. So again, it's just sort of like the preliminary work of like deciding like what time period and stuff you're working with. You're also going to go through and make a list of the hero objects that you're going to do for each person. So like hero object, furniture, decorative objects, and who is responsible for each of these things. Hmm? So I would say, I was going to say anything that you use for like a CGI 1 final would be fine. So like, it should be something that's like reasonably complex with like reasonable visual interest. Right. Yeah, you have to make something new. Yeah, and then, so, I mean, part of the reason that I'm having you guys do this early, I am going to look through this stuff, and if anything's like stupidly simple or like stupidly over complex, I'll be like, hey guys, like you should like pick a new object for that. And again, I'd rather catch that like week 3 than like week 7, which is why I'm having you guys do this earlier. But yeah, so again, like as a team, reason you do this as a team is that you want to make sure that like you don't have like 3 people modeling like the same vase or like the same piece of furniture. But yeah, so just like kind of collaborate, see like what you guys all kind of want to make for your room, do that. And then for each individual person, you're going to create a document which answers the following questions. Like just here are the questions. I'm not necessarily going to read them all out loud. In terms of how the viewer should feel about it, it's just like description of space might just be like it's like a dingy room with low ceilings. It should invoke a feeling of like neglect and kind of like sadness in the viewer. I don't need like 7 paragraph things, mostly just like kind of basic, like am I going for like happy, sad, like playful, like is it a disgusting, like beat up, filthy room that you would be afraid to walk in kind of thing. Who does the room belong to, what's their hobby or work, etc. Just like some backstory on the room. Why they own like the main objects that you'll be making in the scenes. Like if it's a toy maker, you know, why do they have like a bunch of dolls lined up on the wall and like the tools that they have kind of thing. Why do they have a sewing kit? How old is the space? For this it might be interesting to include details like the building it's in is 100 years old, which is why there's like gross cracks on the wall, but the person has like renovated it and sort of like repainted, all that kind of stuff. Old walls are like disgusting. All the paint just like makes layers and it's icky. But age of person using the space might influence like the level of care. Like if it's like a really, really elderly person, they might not be able to get around and like dust off a lot of the stuff in the room. They might not be able to reach down low, so like a lot of the tools might be up higher, that kind of thing. Again, it's just like additional information to like think of how to lay out your space. And again, here's like the list of objects you and your team will be creating. Again, just duplicate this. It's gonna sound really stupid, but I would actually appreciate, so like for all the group stuff, if you just make like a little zip file with like your, like here is our group project thing. If you can submit that with your individual assignments, so like for each person you're submitting all of the group work and all of the like individual questions, that would be great. Again, it just makes it like so much easier for me to grade and like see exactly who's doing what, especially if I need to reference it in like later weeks. So any questions on anything we've gone over so far? All right. And then this is again an individual thing, but just do like a few quick concept sketches of the look of the final scene. Not looking for anything like crazy fancy here. Maybe just like some really, really simple sketches of basic layout of the environment. Are there any like weird like archways in the ceiling, like angled ceilings, where the windows might be, and then just like a quick list of like where are you going to put the objects that you're making. And then just like, you know, for space heavily used or brand new, just like throw in some notes on the side. Like maybe like draw on a crack on the wall and be like, cracks in wall because, you know, water damage or something like that. Like, again, it doesn't need to be fancy, just sort of like spitball, like, things that'll help show off your space, if that makes sense. Insert reference photography as necessary. If there's like, you know, the perfect example of like a wall texture you like, throw that in there. Label and define things as necessary. Again, I don't need you to like render everything out in like crazy detail. If you just draw me like a sort of rough vase shape and like a rough chair shape and say like fancy Victorian chair, that's fine. Important thing, the space should have at least one window and one door. For the final project, you'll be doing one daylight. You'll be lighting the scene for daylight and lighting the scene for night. So it is important to be able to actually like see outside and have, you know, that light showing in the room. Does that make sense? Cool. In terms of other stuff, you'll also be collecting like a little bit of photography reference, so like particularly of the models that you're responsible for. Again, I don't necessarily care for your final projects, especially if you're doing like some really like weird old furniture, you might not be able to find orthographics of that. Like you might not have access to it, so you might need to find a bunch of reference pictures online, and then you might need to like draw your own orthographics. Here's where you just find as much reference as possible, kind of deal. And maybe if you have anything like wood or fabric, find some pictures of like wood finishes or like fabric textures that you like that you can recreate later. Find some stuff for lighting and mood reference. So again, you are doing one daylight and one night scene. So maybe find some pictures of like a dimly lit room that you like, or if you're gonna have like a bunch of candlelight in the room, find some pictures of similar stuff to the feel that you're trying to recreate in your final. Blah blah blah. And then stuff should sort of fall within the stuff provided by your team. And that's mostly just like, if you decide on like a Victorian room, don't choose like weird like IKEA furniture to put in it kind of thing. So yeah. And then, so any questions on that? Yep.
Should we each be picking our different objects to model in our group?
Yeah. Yeah, so the idea is basically of doing the group work is to get you used to working in teams, but also you would start out, like each person would start out with at least 9 different objects that you can put into your scene and sort of have populate the room to reduce the work of having to like create a full environment. So yes, they should be separate objects. Mm-hmm.
Our rendered scenes can be different from our teammates, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they actually should be. So basically each person is going to be like laying out and like texturing the room and stuff separately. And that's, the team thing is again just sort of like, it gives you a little bit more to start with when you actually start populating the room. So you're not stuck with like something completely empty. But yeah, so feel free to do your own like crazy weird thing for whatever your final scene is. Any other questions? All right. So for what to submit, again, here's just like the stuff for the group, just like going over everything. But again, each person, if you could submit, just like duplicate the group work and just submit that for each person. And then just like all the stuff with your description. For the folders, for your reference images, if you could just organize, it doesn't need to be like crazy meticulous, just throw in like a folder for like lighting reference and put all of your lighting reference in there, like that kind of stuff. It like again doesn't need to be like super crazy organized, just like enough where it's like I can kind of see like where you're going with the space, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's pretty much that. Any questions on this? All right. Any questions on anything else we've gone over today? All right. In that case, be free.